Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and you're all very welcome to this session of the Global Civic Forum. As Katrina said, communicating better in a digital age. As Katrina said, my name is Ralph Victory. I'm the director of the Communications Unit team here at the department, and delighted to be here with you. And at the outset, may I introduce you to our panel. Let me see, in no particular order, but just let's go alphabetically. Amina Healy is our colleague who's here from Twitter. Amina is originally from Ankara in Turkey, moved to Dublin in 2015 to work at Twitter's European, Middle East and Africa headquarters based here in Dublin. You are, I understand, public policy manager for Turkey, Spain and Italy, so covering a broad region there. So your role would entail Twitter's relationships with government, civil society, NGOs. I understand you told me beforehand you're well qualified to comment on diaspora matters. You've lived something like 3/4 of your life abroad outside Turkey, so we're glad to have you here today and that you're able to join us. I'm joined on my left by Deirdre ní Luasaigh. Deirdre is from the Gaeltacht in Dunquin on the Dingle Peninsula in beautiful County Kerry. You started off, I think, working in your dad's bookshop in Dingle, and since then your career has included book design, digital scanning and archiving. Deirdre moved south a number of years ago to Sherkin Island off the coast of West Cork, and in 2014 she and her husband Adrian, who's also here with us today, founded a digital archiving company, Culture Arc, which protects organisations' culture, heritage and reputation by preserving their stories. From the letters of 1916 right through to the tweets of 2017. And Deirdre and Adrian run Culture Arc from Sherkin Island, and I think they claim with some justification they are Ireland's most southerly software startup. So that's quite a good claim. Claire O'Donoghue-Vilajkic is the Government and Politics Client Partner for Europe, Middle East and Africa at Facebook and Instagram. Claire, you've been working with Facebook here in Ireland for the last 7 years. You support organisations and agencies to get the most out of their Facebook and Instagram platforms by helping them to define and achieve their goals through creating content for mobile platforms, telling visual and emotional stories, and building relationships through dialogue. You, likewise, Claire, have lived outside of Ireland and can justifiably claim to be a member of the Diaspora, working before with the OSCE in Kosovo and also in the NGO sector in Peru and Thailand. Claire holds a BA in Communications from DCU and an MA in International Politics and Security from the University of Bradford, and she and her family live here in Dublin. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming and thanking our panel. Okay, so let's press on. I have been reminded several times about the importance of sticking to our schedule. We're now just past 2:30. We are due to run until about 4 o'clock. And what I propose to do is to break down our discussion overall into some broad themes. And I was saying beforehand, just to emphasize, really not so much to be rigid about any of the issues that we want to discuss today, but just to help to frame our discussion and to make sure that we make best use of the time. So the first of those I'm going to put to our panel just for some brief initial comments, and then put it out to the floor, then maybe come back to gather up some questions or comments or queries that anybody might want to raise, and we have some roving microphone colleagues with those available to let you pose your questions, and then after that collect those, put them back to our panel, and then move on to our second and third themes, and as I say, make sure that we make best use of the time. So with that, I'm going to kick off and invite everybody to perhaps at the outset, I'll just flag this and we'll come back to it at the end, but in your packs this morning you should hopefully have received what we call the Global Irish Communication Handbook. So I just want to give that a brief shout out at this stage. We'll talk about it a little bit more towards the end, but we hope that you'll also find that useful in the context of this exchange and this discussion. Okay, so we're communicating better in a digital age. We're using new tools to stay connected. But maybe just at the outset to ask the very basic but very important question of what makes for an effective communication strategy, and what are the ways that we can actually develop such a strategy? Maybe, Claire, if I may, I'll kick off with you. What do you think makes for a good communication strategy?
Thanks, Ralph. I think the primary element is that it has to be goal-oriented. We have to be very clear from the outset what is the actual goal of our strategy for ourselves as an organisation. What do we want to achieve? and what is the value that we're going to bring to the people who are going to receive that message. Being clear on your goals from the outset, and these should be SMART goals, right? So we know our specific, measurable, etc. I think the first two, being specific about those goals, especially in the digital space, there tends to be a feeling of, okay, and we'll do digital comms as well, or we'll do social as well. No, we need to root it back into what are the specific goals. And they need to be measurable as well. And I think that's where digital can be very helpful in this respect. The tools that we have available across digital platforms in terms of measurability of impact, that you can measure immediately the number of people you're reaching, whether people are sharing your content and so on. Measurability is going to be really effective for you in working out, has this comm strategy actually delivered the goals we set out? The other elements I think are very important to making that effective, primarily being authentic, having that authentic voice. Some organizations will have a very clear, identity of who they are and who their constituents are and how they communicate with them. For others, that's a little bit harder. You have to try and define, what is our voice. And again, especially within the social space, where we're used to hearing from people on a personal basis, on an individual basis. The comm strategy of an organization or an entity needs to try and bring that authentic tone of voice to the way in which we're communicating with people. All of that said, we've got to be thinking visually. We live in a very, very visual age. We've moved way past the era of television. Everybody has a mobile phone in their pocket. That mobile is constantly interrupting us, guiding us, and showing us visually led content. So trying to get that authenticity in your voice, communicating it in a visual way, and having it work in mobile is going to be effective in your strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. Deirdre, can I turn to you and get your take? I suppose you're coming at this from also a broader cultural perspective as well. What's your take on this issue?
I would say that, I grew up in Dunquin in the Dingle Peninsula, and it's overlooking the Blasket Islands, and there will be some people in this room who remember the Shanachie Peg, the great storyteller of her time. And because of that, as a young child in school, what we had to do was to transcribe her stories. So we transcribed the voice of Peg, which was recorded on wax cylinders, and we wrote down all those words as primary school. This was something that just needed to be done, and we did it. And this is part of keeping her stories alive and making them possible to share them and to publish those stories. And that was a hugely important project that my primary school teacher was involved in as his part of a historian. And because of this rich heritage of Dunquin and because of the Blasket Islands and there's music and poetry and all of that, people all came to visit us in Dunquin. We never left Dunquin Parish or Dingle Peninsula because we didn't need to. So many people came to engage with this rich cultural heritage that was already there and to share their stories and to make new friends. And people did this constantly. And I think that today, that's really what needs to be the thing that drives the social media strategy. So if you're doing a strategy and it is all about the tools and how you approach that, where that comes from, this feeds the authenticity of that. So you're bringing in the natural stories of your history, of your community, but actually, and in this case, it was Peg's story, which is historical, but actually today, all of that information today is being done through social media on Facebook and Twitter and things that only exist in the social media platforms out there. And actually, sometimes we lose and we forget to remember to gather these things as well and use those as they're the voice of today's communities, but also the voice of yesterday's communities, and it's bringing this past and present into the future. And I think that's a really important part of a strategy as well.
So I think there you're really emphasising content and stories that people can identify with and relate to. Amina, would you agree in terms of somebody at the outset of considering a comm strategy, maybe they're a bit daunted, or they would say, well, look, we're only a small organisation, we don't really need to think in strategic terms, but maybe they do. What would your advice be?
Absolutely. And I agree completely with both Claire and Deirdre that a lot of it really has to do with what your organization's mission is and what you hope to accomplish, but also in understanding who your audience is with regard to that mission. So are they, for example, individuals who are going to advocate on your behalf on a policy issue, or are they members of the community that you want to reach out to and include in a conversation about culture and local history, for example? Mm-hmm. So I think understanding your audience is very important. And as you kind of include the digital strategy as part of the overall communication strategy. As Claire said, it's really important to look at the metrics that that resonate with your audience too. And the beauty of the social media platforms is that you can see very clearly what types of content really resonate, what times even that they resonate, and revise your planning accordingly. So I'll give you a funny example, for example, from Turkey. In Turkey, coffee is drunk in the afternoons after lunch, whereas in the US, for example, it's primarily taken in the morning with breakfast. So when you look at charts, for example, around conversations around coffee, in the US, you'll see that the conversation peaks in the morning hours, whereas in Turkey, it'll peak in the afternoon hours. So again, it's just also being aware of those cultural nuances and knowing what's driving your audience's behavior.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you very much. Okay, well look, I'd emphasize, I think throughout our discussion we will definitely have the opportunity to come back and I think talk about some of the specifics of some of the particular platforms. We're joined by the representatives of Twitter and Facebook today, so we will come back to that. But just at this part of our discussion, could I suggest that we just focus on the broader, as I say, strategic aspects of, for all of us and very much the department included, we're looking, I suppose, to connect with our audiences, but to know and understand our audiences is perhaps the first step in that regard. So with that, maybe I will open it up to the floor and invite some questions or comments. I'm going to gather those up perhaps in batches of 2 or 3 or 4 rather than kind of just doing it one at a time. As was the case this morning, could I invite anybody who would like to ask a question just to identify yourself by name and by organisation, please, and then we'd be happy to continue the discussion on that basis. So who would like to take the plunge in terms of, at this stage of our conversation? We have somebody here in the front row. Thank you.
Good morning, Trevor O'Clougherty, Shannon Dorla, Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin spokesperson on the Diaspora. I suppose in days gone by, Irish communities gathered together in GAA clubs, in halls, at dances, in pubs, on building sites, etc. How do we now build virtual communities, virtual meeting places, and how do we get the word out to people who may be in similar geographic areas who aren't talking to each other? Because you could have people living maybe a couple of doors from each other, but they don't realise there's somebody from Ireland next door to them or just down the road, and we're trying to create those communities and link in with people. Agus mahu as an inspirato hit peg. Good morning.
Senator, thank you. Okay, thank you. We have another contributor, I think. Thank you. Dan.
Dan Dennehy, Hibernians in America. Ralph, you were part of the great improvement in communications between the consulates, the embassy, and the organizations. And, a few examples is we had a couple of disasters and some emergency situations and some immigration situations where representatives of a lot of organizations came into individual consulates, and we had video conferences from one part of the country back to Ireland and then to the other individual parts of the consulate. So I just want to say that that is something that we definitely have benefited from so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. We have another speaker. Thank you.
Karen McHugh, Safe Home Ireland. Just wanted to ask about developing a communication strategy for those who are not into Facebook, Twitter, or general social media, and I suppose particularly for some of the immigrants abroad who are not, using computers and using Facebook, using Twitter, and that we don't leave them behind either, because I think it's really important. Communication is very, very broad. Just some ideas on how we could reach those audiences broader than that. Thank you.
Thank you. And another contributor just at the back of the hall also. Thank you.
Thank you. I know recently someone described social media as Facebook and Twitter, like you're getting all these alerts, so you go to your front door and there's no one there. We spend all this time reading tweets and Facebook. I don't do either. I'm just wondering if I'm missing out on something. But I've but I do have a blog, and I think that's enough for me. But my son and my cousins keep saying, "Oh, you should go on Facebook, Jerry." And but I don't know why. Maybe it's an age thing, but that's why I'm here at the workshop.
Very good, excellent. And I'll take just one or two more questions, and then I'll gather these up, and we'll go back to our panel, and then go out to the floor again. So if I could take, I have one person here to my right, and then another to my left, and then we'll go back to the panel. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Brent Irish Advice. I was wondering, obviously a lot of companies do have those corporate social programs, whether there are any organisations out there that do pro bono work, or whether, you know, organisations like ourselves who are quite small, maybe we just sort of try our luck and, you know, approach Twitter or Google or whoever and say, you know, would you be able to help to develop a sort of communication strategy for us?
Okay. And another gentleman here.
Hi, Brendan MacDonald is my name from Live, Work, Play Ireland, and the day job is with IDA Ireland. I'm just interested on your take on the, I suppose, more targeted towards Facebook and Twitter, on the algorithms that you guys use and how, you know, stories come up in people's news feeds, because it seems to me that if you have, you know, you could post what you think is a very informative post on a particular issue and it would be buried down the field in the news feeds, whereas if, you know, you could post something else and it could get a few likes, and that seems to get a lot more likes by kind of default, I suppose, and appears higher in the news feed. So maybe if you can just comment on that and how you guys interact with organizations who are not able to, I suppose, use paid ads or targeted sponsored issues. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think, if I may, I might just hold that last question in reserve. As I say, we will come on at a later stage in our discussion to some of the real specific uses of particular platforms and how people might make best use of those. But if I could go back to some of the question, and I think Senator O'Flaherty, your question about building virtual communities, I suppose that in essence is a very strategic objective as such, and one I think that would be very pertinent to a lot of the organisations that are represented here today. Maybe I'd put that to Claire first of all, and then to Amina, and just to get your what in your experience, virtual communities, do they exist? Do they operate well, or where have you seen them operating well, and how?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly you're right to say that the shape of our communities is changing. You know, the traditional identifiers as being, you know, my community is my parish, for example. That is very much changing in the digital age. There are new networks that are developing, and they are very much more global oriented rather than local. That's not to say that there aren't local communities springing up in the digital space as well. I personally am a member of a Facebook group for my little neighbourhood in Dublin, which I joined mostly just for practical reasons, you know, to share some things that are happening in the community. But this is something Deirdre and myself were discussing. There's also been a little bit of almost sort of community archiving and sharing of nostalgia within the community by sharing photographs from Stoney Batter 30 years ago and people tagging their friends and so on. So the local communities are not going away, but they are changing shape, and the way in which people are engaging with them is certainly changing. The ubiquity of your mobile and the fact that people are checking Facebook 10, 20 times a day is going to shape the ways in which they identify with their communities. As we start looking more globally, and you know, certainly for diaspora communities and so on, I think what we see driving the organic creation of those communities on Facebook tends to be shared characteristics which potentially go beyond just a nationality identifier. So it might be Irish in Australia, but let's be honest, there are very, very different Irish in Australia. Is there perhaps a different experience for Irish mums in Australia? And do we want to share some of our experiences of bringing up our kids in Australia? So I think it's kind of identifying those shared values within the wider community, and that's happening organically on Facebook anyway. Like, I'm sure you know, we've got almost 2 billion people on Facebook at this stage, 1.8 something billion. Of them, 1 billion, more than 1 billion at this stage, are in Facebook groups. So a group being different to a page, this isn't being, you know, driven by an organization as such. Many of these are grassroots, organically developed groups of people who have started to connect based on those shared identifiers. So again, speaking for myself personally, I'm in, you know, local groups related to my life in Dublin. When I was living overseas, I was in expat groups, I'm in parenting groups. There are many groups related to health issues. If people want to share their experience of a health issue which perhaps they can't share with people in their local community because nobody else has the health condition that they have, but they're able to connect with other people around the world. So I think that the truth about how do we strengthen and help these groups grow, it's in finding out what are those emotional inflection points. What are the areas that people care about and they want to share with each other, and encouraging them to find ways to do that within the digital space.
I think what you're saying there, if I understand correctly, it's not just nationality alone, but it's nationality plus, as you say, these common interests or common concerns or motivators as such that it's going to bring people together.
Let's imagine it's happening offline, and I happen to be an Irish person in Australia, and I go into a meetup and I meet 20 or 30 people who are also Irish people in the pub, and we're going to have a chat. I'm probably going to end up bonding most with the people with whom I find something else in common beyond just our Irishness. And I think that's what we see happening in the digital space as well.
Amina, could I turn to you on that point also, if you would agree, and I suppose to address the point that was raised by as well as to for somebody maybe who's all new to this and figure, well, I don't need this. Is this way of connecting with people, with counterparts, with people that share common interests, is that becoming a new reality? Is it increasingly a combination of connecting with people in both online and offline that seems to be the trend, the pattern emerging?
Definitely. And I would say that actually the strongest social media accounts or communities are also those that continue offline as well. So to reiterate what Claire said too, I think common interests are very important. Social media is incredible in that it really helps to get rid of the limitations of distance and time zones. So in that respect, it's a really valuable tool for diasporas in particular. We can go into kind of the specifics of the different platforms, but for example, with Twitter, you can really reach 320 million users, potentially millions of whom have common interests with you. So it may not be necessarily that you're just reaching Irish audiences, but you're reaching Americans who are also interested in hurling, for example. So in that respect, it can really strengthen the community even more based around those common interests, I would say. And then again, what we've seen is just that the communities that, for example, have calls to action or that somehow drive the activity online to offline through events are really the ones that are the closest and most tight-knit.
Okay, thank you. Deirdre, would you like to come in on this point? Any of the points raised?
There's a couple of things actually that have been striking me as the questions have been asked and as you've been talking as well. And I think one of the things is that social media is entirely a reflection of our human selves. So whatever we are as people, that's what's happening on social media. They're not distinct, they're not separate, and they are just us and what we do and what we have to say. And it's interesting that there's two comments in relation to, should you be on social media? Is there any benefit to it? One of the lovely things is myself and my husband, with our work, we're traveling quite a lot. We live on a very small remote island, dependent on ferries and weather and all of that. And one of the lovely things about social media is that even though we may not be physically seeing a lot of our friends over our whole lives, but there's a friend in London who has been following our life and photographs of the fox and on the ferry and all these things. And she's going, I feel like I'm connected to your life, even though I don't get to see you every week or we don't get to have lunch, I'm still connected with you. And it's that online, offline significance that's huge. And to do with the virtual meeting places and so on, I spoke to somebody last night actually who was talking about the Letters of 1916, which is a wonderful project, and a lot of that was about digitization and bringing this online. But one of the events that happened in Chicago was an invitation to the Irish in America to bring anything that they had physically into a room and to talk about it and to share. And it was hugely popular. It was a really, really significant physical event that translated into some online connections. And having events that are rooted in the real world but also mirrored online, and actually that somebody does things with that online then into other spaces is huge. So I think it's the combination really of offline going online.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just reading over my notes here, we did have a question about algorithms, and I promise we will come back to that question, I'm sure, in due course. But if I may, I just wanted to turn back to one thing which I think is a specific question about help that might be available for smaller organisations out there. I don't know, I mean, you were mentioning beforehand that you do have some kind of practical guidelines available, as do we in the handbook, which we hope you'll find useful also. But would you like to just give that a mention? I'm sure Facebook probably has something similar as well, and just what that might entail. And then obviously if there's more detail that people want to find out about afterwards, I'm sure they could approach you and find out more about that. Would you like to talk about that just for a moment?
Yeah, definitely. So we do have a handbook that we've prepared for NGOs that shares really the basic kind of Twitter 101 on how to set up a Twitter account, how to start using it, how to find accounts to follow or engage in conversations, and then it also goes into more detailed kind of best practices about how to increase engagement with your audience. So I'm happy to share that via email to share with the audience as well. Okay. And then in addition, just with the work that we do with Twitter for Good, which is our social responsibility outreach, we do work with organizations in a number of different fields, whether it's freedom of expression or emergency response, for example, and we provide training again and also add credit to help them with their missions.
Right, very good. And Claire, I'm sure Facebook likewise is active in this space, I'm sure.
So I believe it's actually mentioned in your handbook. Right. We have a portal for non-profits who obviously are going to approach Facebook and indeed Instagram in particular ways. That both platforms are, of course, free to use, and there are a large number of tools which can help you run really, really effective, what we would call organic campaigns, where you do not need to spend any money on advertising at all in order to start driving those communities and reaching people and getting people sharing your content. The truth is, you want to get embedded in the platform, you want to understand what sort of content works well, getting that authenticity of voice and so on. But the tools are there in the portal. I believe it's nonprofits.fb.com, but it is in your handbook. And there's a similar portal for SMBs as well, because again, it's going to be similar but different if you are a startup or working indeed with startups around the world. We do offline events occasionally as well. We obviously run a fair amount of them here in Ireland because this is our Europe, Middle East and Africa headquarters. We occasionally do them in market as well. One of our current programs is called Boost Your Business, which is oriented, primarily towards SMBs, and again with the understanding that you don't have vast marketing budgets to spend on an effective comm strategy. How can you use the digital tools available to you, which are essentially free, but can deliver an effective strategy? So starting with the portals, those portals will also include groups that you can join, pages you can sign up to, mailing lists, etc., get notified about the events that we're running. But we very much want to kind of place those tools in your hands immediately. You don't need to wait until we run an event to be able to find out how to use them.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, look, I'm just conscious of the time, so maybe if we were to move on to our second theme of the afternoon, which would be that of specific challenges and opportunities. I think we've already started to touch upon this in some of our exchanges so far this afternoon, but specific challenges and opportunities arising for Irish diaspora organisations in the social media era. For example, has the availability of channels and platforms for immediate contact with home, if it's now these days altogether so much easier to connect with home, well, what impact does that have on the role of diaspora organisations? Does it make your role maybe less important or maybe even more important? Maybe it's a case of considering about operating differently in relation to these platforms. How could diaspora organisations maybe work to capitalise on these opportunities, or maybe address some of these challenges? Maybe Deirdre, could I start with you on this one? What do you think?
Well, I think social media has completely changed and revolutionised how we communicate in ways that we just couldn't even imagine 10, 15 years ago. And for the better, there's no doubt about that, that the communications, the conversations, the engagements between individuals and people and organisations and groups has made everything much better. And for particularly people who are geographically quite far apart or possibly health reasons can't travel and so on, to be able to engage through social media is critically important to feeling connected, really, I think. So I think there are hugely important, and it's a huge opportunity. I think possibly one of the biggest challenges is really about it's an information overload. There's an information overload everywhere. It's not just on social media, it's online, it's on the street, it's in billboards. There's so much to see and everyone's trying to catch our eye. And I think probably the biggest challenge is how to refine and to narrow down and remove the irrelevant parts to either a social media campaign or any conversation, is that we can, and actually even coming to talk today, there's so much that I wanted to talk about, but it's an hour and a half, and and I'm sure it's the same for everybody. It's actually refining down what's the important part, what are the important elements of the stories, and which are the important stories, and actually it's how to do that. So it's almost one step before you get onto the social media platform, is how do you gather these stories and how do you decide which ones are really relevant and really interesting. And this is really about engagement, and this comes back into being in Dunquin and Peg Sayers, and there's a whole bunch of writers around that time, and it drew in so many people. And I mean, even Star Wars was there last summer. It just invites so many people in, and I think social media entirely replicates that. If you have enough stories that are of relevance to people, then people will come, and I think it takes a little bit of time, as with everything, about how to get the people that you're interested in and getting the numbers up, but you have to start with having relevant stories that you've gathered, and it is a refining, I think, of those stories and the gathering.
I'm really glad somebody found a way to work Star Wars into our discussion today, as it's May the 4th, so may the 4th be with you and all that. Okay, Amina, what's your thoughts on this issue of, there are opportunities for sure. We've already been touching upon these, but maybe there's some challenges out there as well. What do you think?
I mean, I think the opportunities far exceed the challenges. These new mediums kind of provide an opportunity to have a town hall without the physical constraints, and in that sense, really help to foster dialogue and democratize communication in a way that sometimes, especially marginalized communities, never had access to. So, for example, there's one account that for me is really interesting. It's of a chief in a Kenyan village. His name is Chief Kariuki, and he set up a Twitter account to communicate with his own community, which consists of subsistence farmers. And he, despite the fact that there's no internet in the region, he's still able to do it via SMS, and the community is very much dependent now on that information and very much mobilizes around it. So if, for example, somebody gets lost or somebody's goat goes missing, they really are able to mobilize around that. So that's something that you wouldn't have seen in any other medium. So in that respect, huge democratization of communication and an ability to do it in a very cost-effective way as well. The challenge, I would definitely agree with Deirdre, is really getting to refine the content so that, again, it resonates with the audience. And that's, I think, once you get the hang of the medium and the best practices, it becomes almost intuitive. And again, it's a process of understanding what your audience is looking for. But I mean, I would say that probably that's maybe the biggest challenge, is staying focused on what the audience is interested in. But anything in terms of finding that audience, I think once you become engaged and find certain hashtags or accounts that are really relevant, it's easy to build a community around it, especially when you have a strong mission.
Okay. Claire, would you agree? I think what's common to the comments so far is that social media clearly will give you scale where maybe you didn't have it before. So that's obviously the opportunity, but the challenge involved in that is responsibility. Just building though on what Amina was saying, that issue of staying focused on what audiences are interested in, but in terms of maybe developing audience interest in a particular theme or topic, or maybe helping people to realize that there's something maybe that they should be interested in or should be concerned about that they maybe didn't fully appreciate before. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm afraid we're a very boring panel because we all agree with each other completely. Certainly, you know, as Deirdre was saying, I think one of the biggest challenges in terms of the way in which we engage with messaging today is the ubiquity and the always-on nature of media consumption. You know, we are reading fewer newspapers, we are watching less TV programming, but we almost all, indeed subsistence farmers in Africa having mobiles, perhaps not yet on the internet, but you know, mobile use of the internet has now exceeded desktop use. The always-on nature of media stimuli and messaging coming to us is a challenge. You know, how do we create messages which are going to break through and which are going to be meaningful? And certainly, as you say, Ralph, you know, how do we steer conversations or shape them in ways that, you know, traditionally the broadcast media and journalists and so on would have helped us shape the conversation. Now there are all these different voices coming to us all of the time. But that's also the opportunity. So unlike, you know, 20, 30 years ago, where you'd be putting your press release out and desperately hoping that somebody would pick it up and run with it, essentially now the nature of broadcast and of communications has been democratized. You know, any individual can put a message out there and get it out to the world using Twitter, using Facebook. You can get your voice heard. There are tools available to you in terms of, you know, if you've got a smartphone these days, you have a camera which is going to produce broadcast quality video footage which you can put out there. You can even live broadcast now on both of our platforms. The tools which are available to us now in the digital space, you know, even within the 7 years that I've been at Twitter, at Facebook, gosh, what a mistake, eh? Within the last 7 years, the changes which have occurred in terms of the actual technology which is available is simply unbelievable when we think back. Any person in this room right now could produce a comm strategy which has live broadcast capabilities, which has the visual beauty and impact of a photojournalist, which has the writing style and reach of a print journalist. We could do it today. The question is, are we investing in working out how to use those tools in order to leverage that democratization of communication?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. There's a lot in there. Okay, so I'm going to open up this part of our discussion now to the floor also. But I do, if I may, I'm going to ask somebody, call upon somebody from the floor, and that is, if she's in the room, Ciara Kenny from the Irish Times. Is Ciara with us? Great, Ciara, thank you very much. I'm glad that you could join us, please.
My name is Ciara Kenny. I work with the abroad section of the Irish Times. I would have met many of you at the last Civic Forum here in Dublin Castle when the section was called Generation Emigration. So we've had a rebranding and an expanding of the section since then. I'd just like to pick up on something that Claire was talking about there, her last point on the democratization of communications. And that's really what we were aiming to do with the section when it's set up, and what we've been doing ever since was to offer a platform for Irish people living overseas to share their own stories. So we put the call out on social media originally about 5.5 years ago, and since then we've shared close to 2,000 stories that have been written by our community themselves and published through the Irish Times website. So it's almost like a blog for Irish people living overseas, and we've removed, in most instances, that the middleman, the journalist, out of the equation. It's more editorially controlled than just a forum or a social media platform, in that we do edit the stories and they're processed, but it does have the reach, as Claire was saying, of a national newspaper and a national media website. So this section of your discussion is all about opportunity. So what I'm here today to as well as reporting on the forum, is to offer the opportunity for Irish organisations who are here in the room to use our platform to share your own stories of what it's like to work with Irish community organisations around the world. Fiona mentioned there earlier, I was asking about what opportunities are there for immigrants who might not necessarily be on social media, on Twitter or Facebook. Our website will still be able to reach those people even if they're not on social media. But we do also use social media a lot to disseminate the content to a very broad audience. But also one thing that hasn't been mentioned is how social media can be used as well to gather stories too, which I think is really important. It's a way of gathering stories from your community of followers as well, and that's how we would use it. So as I mentioned, I'm here to talk to anybody who would be interested in sharing the story of their organisation, and we have a regular column where Irish people working with organisations around the world share their personal story as an insight into the work that their organisation does. So if anybody is interested in having a chat with me after that, I'd be very interested to meet them. So thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot from it too, so thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Ciara. Just that point of gathering stories, I think that's really important. Thank you for bringing that out. And I think it really echoes what you were saying, Deirdre, about the sheer gathering of content and the importance of that and having that available and preserving that over time as well. Absolutely. But as I say, I do want to go out to the floor. I saw a number of hands going up. So if we could get microphones to some of those people who would like to ask a question or make a comment. And once again, just ask you to identify yourself and then please go ahead. Thank you.
Hello, hi. My name's Wyn Lawler. I work for Irish Community Care, based in the northwest of England. I'd just like to thank you very much for highlighting the positivities around social media. I'd just like to bring a little word of caution in the fact that we're finding that hate crime in social media and actually being used against our communities, particularly against the travelling community, to engage local people in hate speak and hate activities, and actually people who should be more cognisant of the Equalities Act, which is the thing that protects our BME communities in the UK. Are often the people, like local councillors, who are leading and corralling people within social media and Facebook and other kind of community places, where they can actually find an energy and an outlet for that disgruntlement. As a community organisation, managing that and the resources of managing that and trying to find out where all of those places are, you know, a local newspaper can trigger 3 Facebook pages, and then you've got to monitor all of their kind of feedback as well. Hugely resource kind of like implications. And one of the issues that we have is that when we do approach Twitter and Facebook, it's about getting those closed down very quickly. And we find that by working with the police, we can do that, and working with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. But actually, there's other issues about how people feel safe in those spaces that they are communicating in themselves when they're seeing that hate speak about themselves. And I think as an Irish person who grew up in the 70s in the northwest of England and faced hate speak and hate actions against us directly, we always had the opportunity of going in and the doors were closed and we felt safe at home. And actually with Facebook, Twitter and all the other social media places, you're not even safe in that environment. I think we're looking at that around the mental health of young people, aren't we? And the bullying aspect of the, you know, activities going on in people's own bedrooms. But I think we need to think wider about our communities, and particularly isolated people, and making sure that there is enough support out there, you know, through community organisations to support them when that does happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots of important points made there. Thank you. Okay, let me. There's a gentleman just sitting, I think, directly in front of you, and then I want to gather some other comments or questions. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Ray Keogh is my name. Our own identity. One point was mentioned about measurability of your impact. And I think there needs to be a bit of caution here as well, because one can say, gosh, I have so many followers on my Facebook or Twitter or blog, etc. But some years ago, I wrote a piece for the Journal, and it was on identity. And I got 22,000 hits. And I thought, well, this is good, you know. But when I looked at the content, it was drivel. I mean, a lot of it was, I believe, by people who hadn't even read the article because it was sort of a response to the last comment, etc., etc. Now, on our own Facebook, our own blog, the hits are not that many, but the average time on site is something like 7 to 10 minutes, and that apparently on an international scale is quite high. The issue would be if we can ensure that the quality content is there and then increase the numbers. That's a big trick.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that contribution. Okay, any other questions? See a gentleman just at the back of the hall, and then I'll come back to this side of the hall. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Brendan Flynn from the Ireland Canada Monument Project in Vancouver. I've been informed by Vancouver Parks Board that the project could be approved in the coming days, which will give recognition to all the Irish in Canada and their contribution to making Canada one of the great nations of the world. So, and part of the success of the project has been made by Facebook and Twitter, and I'd like to thank them personally for the help they've given the project for allowing it to progress. I just wanted to say that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very good. Okay. Well, that's an example of perhaps effective use of social media. So we may like to come back to maybe to hear more about that, or I'm sure anybody in the room who wanted to inquire about that would be happy to do so. We had another contributor on this side, and then I'll come to some others. If we could get a microphone here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nancy Warmington. I am the director of the Irish Cultural Center in Kansas City, Missouri, which for those of you who don't know is right in the middle of the United States. What we have found with social media, one of our challenges is keeping people aware of what is happening in contemporary Ireland. A lot of times, I think you find with multi-generational Irish Americans, people are kind of stuck in an idea of what is Ireland today. And so social media has been very helpful for us to keep people informed on what is happening in Ireland now, what is Ireland today, with the different organizations or businesses that we then follow. Then we can go ahead and share information so that people are getting contemporary information, getting what's happening either with current affairs, with activities or events. We did a lot of things related to 1916, and then particularly with Irish politics, what we're finding is that's a good way to keep people abreast of what's happening in the country today, not what it was 20, 30 years ago, which is what they may find. And it's a very effective way, and it's also a relatively inexpensive way. And I have several young board members who are very good with Facebook and Twitter and who help us with that whole process. So that is a way to help disseminate information, particularly in the States, that people otherwise might not have a way of getting really good, valid information.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We had another contributor on this side of the hall. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Cara. I'm from the London Irish Abortion Rights Campaign. We have about 1,000 members in London who campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment. I just thought I would give an example of a social media campaign that we have run, which it was specific to Irish diaspora. It was called Choice for Xmas. We ran it over Christmas, that was the hashtag. And what we asked members of the Irish diaspora to do was to think of the 11 women a day who travel from Ireland to Britain to access abortion. We asked people to think of those women as they were traveling home for Christmas, and we used this as a way to engage people in what we were doing and also raise awareness for our work. So we asked people to take a picture of their some point of their journey, so their suitcase in the airport, their passport as they're going through customs, some beautiful chair in Heathrow. We left it up to them, so people got quite creative with it. We had a couple of hundred people partake, many coming from London, many coming from all over the world, and it trended multiple times over Christmas. And it was just a good example, I suppose, of a diaspora-specific social media campaign. Our aim wasn't to raise money. I think it is difficult to do that through social media sometimes, but to raise awareness and to engage people in what you're doing in a creative way, it can be really effective.
Thank you. We have another contributor just on this side of the hall. Thank you.
Hi, Austin Comerton, Irish Radio Canada. I've been using social media to support an online radio station. So what I do is actually use Hootsuite, which is a means of pre-programming my tweets. So even though while I'm sitting here in the room, as a particular program might go out on the digital program, a tweet is going out at the same time. And like in Kansas, what I look on the responsibility I have in Canada is how can I bridge what is happening in the Irish scene that has a Canadian relevance as much as possible. Because I find if given that there's so much and such richness coming from RTE and from other media within Ireland and is readily available, it's how can I then provide what is a local hook. And in that context, when that is then hitting the airwaves, to support that simultaneously with Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And the beauty of it is I can now see that over a period of a month, I'm able to hit 70 to 80 countries, and the number of listeners that I see per hour and the peaks, which I could not do when I was over the air on broadcasting just on local radio. So digital media is supporting an internet radio station has proved a very valuable tool and allows me to connect not just locally but now globally.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we might pause there and then I'll come back to the floor for any other contributors, because I think we've just hit a pretty rich vein of ideas and suggestions in terms of opportunities and challenges, and several important themes brought out about the responsibility, I suppose, to monitor social media traffic and I suppose the real world effects of that. And we were talking a little bit earlier on about the offline and online worlds, that the boundaries between them are blurring. We heard about the importance of, in measurability terms, not looking only just at the quantitative aspect, the numbers, but the quality of followers, and then various campaigns, various tools that people use to ensure that they're getting their message across. Maybe, Emma, would you like to comment? Were you struck by any of those ideas or comments or suggestions, or this idea of, I suppose, the contemporary as well as the heritage, the important maybe of achieving a good blend of those kind of themes? What do you think?
Yeah, I know. I really appreciated all the examples that the contributors provided. I didn't know about the choice for Xmas, which was a really great one to hear, and I'd love to find out more about it. The one that I thought of that comes to my mind is the Home to Vote hashtag, which was used widely by the diaspora in coming home to vote for the marriage equality referendum, which is another great choice of how the Irish diaspora is still really active on Irish political issues as well. And so it's great to hear these examples. I also wanted to speak on the issue of abuse and hateful conduct, because that is a very important issue for us, and we have recently taken steps to really strengthen our teams that work on those reports. It's against Twitter rules to engage in hateful conduct and abuse, and we therefore, if you ever come across that kind of an incident, we really request that you report it to us, and with that feedback, it really helps also our internal operations and our own policies. So we're really reliant on the community to report that and provide that feedback to us. But it's an issue that we're focusing on, and as I said, we opened a new reporting flow specific for hateful conduct, and have really tried to bolster our teams to understand the historical context around that as well. So I hope that that when you do come across that, you would report it to the companies.
If I may, I might just jump in on that as well, because it is a very important point, and thank you to the lady at the back for raising it. Facebook, just like Twitter, takes this subject incredibly seriously. I think we also have the humility to recognise that we haven't done as good a job to date as we should have, and that is something that we are actively trying to change at the moment. Of course, if there is any sort of activity taking place on Facebook which is illegal, we are engaging with law enforcement on a daily basis and a regular basis. We also have what we call our community standards, which again, I know Twitter has something similar, which is what sort of behaviour and content we consider acceptable on our platform. Which is even more strict than what's illegal as such. Any content which is on Facebook which you are hurt by or which you consider might be hateful conduct, again, we would ask you to report it through the reporting channels. That's going to help our operations teams, again, to process that, whether that's connecting with law enforcement or just taking that content down. There are also tools available to people who manage pages and groups and so on. You can block certain words from appearing if there are words which tend to be inflammatory and get people angry and so on, that aren't necessarily hate speech as such, but you just don't want them on your page. You don't want your conversations being steered in that direction. You can block certain keywords. You can certainly block individuals who are coming onto your page and causing trouble for you. But, we're not trying to place the burden back onto the page owners. I understand, it is hard work moderating your communities and your pages. Please do use those reporting flows. You may have seen in the media in the last 48 hours or so, we have made a commitment to hiring actually about double the amount of people that we currently have working on that operations team, from about 3,000 to about 6,000 people. We do acknowledge that we haven't been good enough in this space thus far, and we're working hard to change that.
Okay, thank you. Deirdre, may I invite you to comment, if I may, on one particular phrase that I think was used about the local hook. And I'm just really, I was recalling, I think was it Speaker O'Neill back in the 1980s was famously commented about all politics are local. So in the same way, perhaps all stories are local, or at least the best stories are ones that are local, but maybe ones that incorporate universal themes. So they may relate to Dunqueen or maybe another corner of the globe, but would be contain some nuggets perhaps that others can identify with and relate to. Would you agree?
I would agree fully on that, and it's interesting because of when you were talking about in Missouri about the contemporary Ireland and not looking back into the old Ireland, but actually looking to contemporary Ireland. And I think social media plays a huge role in that. And we looked at the Letters of 1916 project, which we're all very aware of, and a lot of us have had some involvement with that. And interestingly enough, about the Letters of 1916, a lot of them were very everyday in their content. They weren't about the very particular events around the Rising on those few days. A lot of them were about very everyday things that were happening in the run-up to the Rising and after the Rising and so on. So they were unimportant at the time, but retrospectively they became really important. And I think that's something that's happening today. And Ciara was talking about the gathering of stories and using social media to do that, is that actually the tweets of 2016 and the Facebook posts of 2016, they are today's equivalent of the Letters of 1916. And they are so important for all of us going forward, is that we don't write letters anymore, and we don't write, very, very rare. We now do all of this through social media, and even email is dropping by. People are tweeting to each other rather than emailing, or Facebook posting about groups and events and so on. So I do think that that's become really important, is that we can be quite disregard the significance of social media because maybe they're short, or maybe there's a lot of them, or maybe we engage with people that we don't know very well. So it's not quite the same as the formality of sitting down to write a letter. But actually, these are our lives right now. And I think you're right, the fact that if you can have one person talking about one thing in their day, in their space, and that being shared out into the world, and the journeys and the vote to vote, those two things, they just evolved from nowhere. So those early hashtag tweets around those are really important. And it's not so much the later ones when everyone got behind them, but the very early ones are actually really, really important. How did that happen? Who was the first to do the first hashtag? That information in 25 years' time is going to be really important as a country who legalised gay marriage and being the first to do so. It's an incredibly important part of our history in Ireland, and this is contemporary Ireland going out into the world, and particularly when things are different in other parts of the world where it's almost like going backwards. So the things that we're doing in Ireland, in contemporary Ireland, and how social media plays that part is enormous. It really is huge.
Okay. Yeah. So achieving that good blend of the contemporary and the heritage is I think is important, as you say.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just looking at the clock at the back of the room, which tells me that we are just into the final half hour of our discussion. Does anybody want to come in on this particular point? I see a gentleman just on this side of the hall, and I do then want to move on to our third and final theme for the afternoon, which is, I think, also related to what we've just been discussing. But please go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon. Michael Merrigan, Genealogical Society of Ireland. We were talking there earlier about social media and connecting with the diaspora in particular, and then also looking at why would a person get on to social media? What is the need for social media? A lot of people, especially generational difference. One thing that we found in the Genealogical Society of Ireland, we had a conference in 1999, believe it or not, the genealogy, the internet and the World Wide Web. And while we had over 100 people at it, there was about 4 that were connected to the web and about 1 who had any real interest or knowledge of it. And the demographics of those who are involved in genealogy tends to be seniors. And what we found now, if we were to hold such a conference, that there will only be the one in the room that is not on the internet or is not connected to the various social media platforms. What social media has done is made the issue of family history, the connectivity, the exploring the various links with the other sides of the family, whether it be in Kansas or in Canada or wherever, very much easier. And the continuance of that conversation and the ease of that, it's showing that that is possible. In other words, give people a reason to come on to social media is important. You're talking about the hook, the local stories, but the most local story that we all have is our family history. And while family history on the internet is huge, family history is also growing very largely on social media. It's a good way to keep in contact, good way actually to share data, and it's also a good way to, if you wish, to look through and see others with your surname and actually introduce yourselves to it. So what we found is using social media might be a challenge for some, but give them a reason to do so and show them the benefit of it.
Thank you very much. If I may say, I think that's an excellent introduction to our third and final theme of this afternoon's discussion, which was to ask the question, so to build on the previous theme of how could Irish diaspora organisations use social media tools to best effect. And I think you've there given a very specific illustration of examples. But maybe could I put it to our panel now, just to, and already I think we've had some great examples this afternoon but maybe with specific reference to diaspora organisations, maybe Irish or other communities abroad that you've encountered in your travels. What do you think has worked best, or how could it be used best, or even some pitfalls to avoid? Maybe, Amina, could we kick off with you on this particular theme? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think with regard to, it's very much a summary, a little bit of our previous points, which is that, I think each organization has to focus on what its mission is, whether, that's uniting the community or advocating on behalf of the community or fundraising. And I think maybe in time it depends. Like, you might have one fundraising campaign or one advocacy campaign. So depending on what your mission is, to really think strategically about the content that you're going to need to get those messages across and to reach the key influencers that can make an impact. So, for example, when you're thinking of an advocacy strategy, for example, thinking about which key influencers would you need to reach out to, or which key NGOs would be your partners in this effort, and really plan that accordingly. And then, that's for an advocacy campaign. But if it's more around uniting the community, it could be bringing to life some of the stories of individuals who are living abroad and then doing an event around it. So really, it depends on I think the mission. But these are kind of provided in detail in the handbook that I'll also email around. I just pulled a few statistics up on what resonates with users on Twitter with regard to NGOs, and I'll share them very briefly. 77%, 79% of users appreciate the latest information on topical issues, so issues of interest to them, and really probably the reason why they're following your account. Similarly, 79 would like links to articles or additional sources of information. 44% appreciate interviews with experts on the issue, and then 32% would like to hear about fundraising appeals. And there's a very high percentage that have retweeted information from NGOs. So overall, I think the social media platforms are very much an open domain for NGOs and civil society to really appeal to users in a variety of ways. I think it's important to, again, kind of think strategically about the content that you're going to share on a consistent basis, whether, maybe plan a calendar, whether it's, talking with a volunteer on Mondays, behind the scenes on Tuesdays, something interactive on Wednesdays, like a poll, for example, to get an idea of what users think on a specific issue. And I think, again, integrating the visual with the verbal is very important in terms of storytelling as well. Like, it really helps to increase the engagement and appeal to a broader audience, and I think builds up the emotional resonance as well. So to the extent that you can combine photos and videos together with texts in a kind of compelling story, that's what's going to really emotionally appeal to people and get them more engaged.
Okay, thank you very much. Claire, could I invite you maybe to take forward some of those points? I think we're talking about these days appealing to people as much in their hearts as their heads, and I think just in conversation prior to this session, I think you used the phrase that we all find ourselves in, I think you used the phrase, an attention economy, that we're all competing as such for people's attention to varying degrees. What do you think works best in that context?
Absolutely. I think in the last probably 4 to 5 years, we've seen a shift within social media away from the novel. It's not new anymore. Pretty much everybody, certainly of certain generations, and the gentleman is right to say that we initially had a slower take-up amongst seniors, but I think we're starting to see that change as well. As communities, including seniors, have begun to see the value in social media. My mother-in-law, for example, had never used a computer even until we introduced her to the idea that she could video chat with her grandson in Ireland. So for her, that's where the value comes from. And I think as you say, I use the term attention economy, where we are really competing for people's attention. There are so many voices and brands and media and stimuli trying to connect with people. How you're going to break through that is by thinking very clearly about what value are you bringing to people. And invariably, at core, we are emotional beings. If you can create a message which triggers that emotional reaction, that is bringing value. That is allowing a grandmother to see her grandson. That is allowing a young person in Canada to hear new Irish music from the Irish music scene, which gives them either a sense of home, or if they're second or third generation, allows them to identify a bit more as Irish than they might have otherwise if they're only listening to local Canadian music, for example. So I think, again, it comes back to that, as you spoke about mission, being sure of what your purpose is and what your actual clearly defined goals are for the organization, but then also flipping it round and thinking about the value and the emotional impact that your work is going to have on your stakeholders, constituents, beneficiaries, and so on, making sure that you're not just doing social. It always kind of breaks my heart if you hear an organization saying, oh God, we have to get on Facebook. Because we're not on Facebook, we have to set up a Facebook page. Don't do that. Don't set up a Facebook page or a Twitter account or an Instagram account or anything just because you have to do social. Think about what is your purpose, what are your goals, and can you use these tools? The clue is in the title of our session today. social media is a tool, not an end in itself. You use these tools to achieve your purpose and to bring value to people. And I think if you keep that in mind throughout, then you'll use those tools effectively.
Okay, thank you very much. Deirdre, would you agree? Social media, a means to an end rather than an end in itself.
Well, actually, funnily enough, Claire did challenge me to say something controversial. And you asked, and then you asked for it to be family friendly. So my controversial line is that it is about the value. It's not about the technology. I know the technology delivers this, but actually it's not about the technology. And I think that it's about what's behind the technology. It's the value. It's the emotional connection, and it's the rich engagement, the cultural engagement. It's the sharing stories, the making new friends, connecting with old friends, and that's really to my mind, the entire purpose of it. And as organisations, that's still the goal. You know, as an organisation connecting with the diaspora, that's still the goal, really, ultimately. And you know, there are other goals around it, of course, but actually it is about the connection. It is about the emotional connection, the value, and that happens before you sign up. You figure that out before you sign up. And I agree. Don't ever start a page or an account of any description just to have it. It has to be engaged. It has to be rich. It has to be culturally rich and full of stories and people and engagement for anyone to want to join and participate and join the conversation. So I was slightly controversial, but not really.
But I think that's also,
sorry.
But that's how you create the virtual community, through the engagement. Because if it's just, you know, a page that has some content that nobody's engaging with, it's very static.
And indeed, it's how you create the content, is by leveraging that community, because we all are hungry for a shared experience of whether it's our cultural heritage or our interest in music or whatever. So as much as you can, you know, stop it being the one-way broadcast media of old, and it being much more, you know, yes, we have a message that we want to get out there, but we also want to hear back from the people that we're bringing this message to, and, you know, what are the items of cultural value to you that you can share with others. So it essentially becomes almost a crowdsourcing of content as well. That's what creates this richness.
In some ways then it becomes a process of good engagement, delivering good content, delivers good engagement, delivers good content, so it becomes that kind of virtuous spiral. Okay, I do want to open up the floor to discussion. I see a number of contributors looking to get in, which is great. Maybe I'll start off with Senator O'Flaherty, and I have another contributor towards the back of the hall, and some other contributors who want to also join the discussion, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, on the question of content, maybe a little bit controversial is who owns the content. And maybe that's what some organisations are quite shy of, is that they feel that if they do put things on Facebook or Twitter, they don't retain ownership, and therefore they're quite reticent to do that. So maybe for Deirdre, from an archiving point of view, if there is, say, a project where you are collecting stories from a community, letters, artefacts, etc., and you want to store them digitally or you want to share them digitally, are there other options apart from Facebook and Twitter which NGOs, other organisations can use?
If I may, could I just gather some content, because as I say, I'm just conscious of time. Sorry, Deirdre, to cut across you. Sorry, gentleman just at the back of the hall who's trying to, if we could have a microphone, please.
Just a couple of quick questions. I think you need to take the euphoria out of the discussions maybe for a moment in the rush to the future, because it's not going that way. I have a PhD mathematician's son who's just come off Facebook last week, and the other guy works for Apple, and he's going to come off, so they're saying, Dad, get off Facebook. I think large organizations who add more people faster than they lose them are actually going to run into danger, because you're not listening to the ones who are actually leaving you. It's interesting that two of the most valuable companies in the world don't produce content. Now, you just bear with me in your business model. So how did you become the most valuable companies in the world when we are the content producers? When I load today, I'm giving you content. Therefore, I should be a shareholder, actually. So it'd be nice to, a couple of shares from Facebook and Twitter wouldn't go astray. Every day I load, and every day somebody in this room loads. Okay. We're giving you your intellectual property and your content, as somebody mentioned. Secondly, I work on projects from Kerry through Clare, Mayo. Broadband issues we know. Rural Ireland is decimated. I'd like to know quickly, how many people are you employing in Dublin? Because when I came from Clare this morning, it's a long way from Clare to here. It's getting further day by day, as the song says. You're concentrating your capital, your human talent and capital in a centre that's bursting at the seams. you're an end-of-the-line business. You don't produce, like in the typical manufacturing terms. Why, if we not improve, can you not take 10% of the people you employ and do a wonderful corporate social responsibility project away from the capital, which is already bursting in so many ways? So.
Okay, well, thank you for that contribution. Okay. Okay. Well, look, of course, all views and contributions are welcome. I will say, to be fair to our panelists, we do want to kind of stay somewhat on topic in terms of the use of social media by the Asper organisation. I'm sure these are all legitimate questions, but in the time available, and to be fair to other contributors who want to get in on the floor, I will try and stick to topics. So with that in mind, I have another gentleman here on the right-hand side and several other speakers who do want to get in. I'm watching keep an eye on the clock. So if I may, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm James Kelly from the Ireland Canada University Foundation. I spoke about this in one of the breakout groups. One of the things we do is we support, with funding from the Department of Gaeltacht, we support the teaching of the Irish language in Canada. And there's such a huge excitement around the language in Canada, we find, from the Irish diaspora and from a wider group as well. But we've been doing this for years, and what happens is people come and they learn the Irish for a few years in Toronto, and then they move to Manitoba or they move somewhere and they lose that link. So we looked at how can we bring this community together, and so we went with a Twitter campaign. Now we just ran out a pilot in April, March-April, at the end of March, and we went with the hashtag Trasna na Dunta, which a lot of people here will know. It's an old song. It means across the waves. And basically what we were looking for was to get people from all around the world, and we worked with the Fulbright and a number of other partners to get the word out, looking for people to tweet a couple of words, what we call the cúplafocal oscailge, with the hashtag Trasna Dunta. And with very little resources, we got about 4,000 tweets from all the continents in the world except for Antarctica. So we're aiming for Antarctica next year. But it was just a very interesting exercise because we realized there's a huge enthusiasm, and this is the Irish language. It's a minority language, but it's something people feel really strongly about. And so we've got great plans for it next year. But yeah, it's just a great way to tap into people's enthusiasm. And I suppose the two sides of it are the people who feel strongly about the Irish language get a chance to come together, but also is the reach of this, because we're not really experts on the whole tracking or whatever, but it seems like somebody said 3 million impressions, which, as I understand it, means that 3 million people saw the hashtag Trasna Dunta around the world. So a small number of tweets, but that makes its way into other people's feeds. So it's a very interesting exercise that we hope to build on next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we do have some other contributors who I see just a gentleman here in the front and also another gentleman at the back, and then I'm going to move to that side of the hall, so please.
Hello, Joseph Healy from the London Irish LGBT Network, and thank you, Deirdre, for mentioning Home to Vote, because that was a very important social media campaign and helped enormously in the marriage referendum. And I've just seen in the Irish Times Abroad, actually, that they're hoping to do the same with the 8th Amendment. So actually the role of the diaspora again through social media may be very important in what's happening in Ireland. But I'd like to address the issue of information overload. I think somebody mentioned it a few minutes ago. We have found that we tend to sort of publicise our events through social media, through Twitter and so on. And I've had younger people saying to me, well, I've so much information on Twitter, I'm actually overloaded, and we didn't actually see it. And they're actually asking for emails to be sent out instead. And it's almost reached a stage where you sort of wonder, do you have to ring people personally because they're so overloaded on social media they don't actually see what's happening. So, I'd like to ask how you actually would address that.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman at the back of the hall.
Hi, I'm Adam Fulham from LatinAmerica.ie. So I recently lived in Chile, and it was great crack. The people, the food, the music, it was amazing. But for about 20 years, you had 200 Irish people in Chile, and very few of them were connected. Very few of them knew each other, even though most of them were in the same city. So what a couple of us did was we made a Facebook group. We asked our embassy in Buenos Aires to send a message with the link to the Facebook group. And within 1 or 2 weeks, half the Irish community of Chile were in a virtual community. And that led to business events, it led to community events, and it led to an Irish Association of Chile. So I would encourage anyone in a non-established community or an established community to try this out, because it worked very well for us in Chile.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that example. Okay, did I see some hands on this side of the hall here? I have one contributor here who would like to ask a question or make a comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarah and from Crossgate Migrant Project. Just to say, it's really heartening to have a look at this global communications handbook, because it's really useful. We've recently implemented a social media strategy really across Facebook and Twitter, and bringing in some of the ideas that have been mentioned. So the calendar, for instance, so that it's not one person's responsibility to do this as an add-on to their job. We're all sharing the responsibility within the organisation. But I think there's a lot of potential as well to use social media as a tool to remain connected with each other. So ESP-funded organizations connecting and using social media as a tool to communicate with one another, and not just with our target audiences, so whether that's service users or people in crisis, but sharing messages with one another. So one of the things that I've been talking to some of the groups, a group in Canada, the Irish Canadian Immigration Centre, and the Irish Support Agency in Sydney, is about creating a LinkedIn group, closed LinkedIn group, because we're looking at different time zones. I mean, conference calls aren't necessarily going to be that useful for us, but where we can ask each other questions. So when it comes to maybe the time of year when we're all putting in our grant applications, hey guys, how did you deal with this? So email is great, but this would be something different, and maybe just another way of using social media as a tool to enhance our capacity.
Okay,
Thank
great,
you.
thank you. We have less than 10 minutes to go, so I'm just, if I may, I'm going to go back to our panel. Unless there are any more contributions to the floor, I don't see any other hands. So look, in terms of a lot of contributions and suggestions and ideas from the floor there, maybe if I could just go back over a few of them, issues such as information overload and you know the importance, I suppose, of establishing the correct ownership around content, and I suppose then some examples of some success stories of where social media platforms have been used. Obviously then there are instances or other scenarios where people feel less comfortable using social media, and I suppose there's a spectrum of experiences in there, and obviously different people are going to take different views, but what strikes you from maybe perhaps not only this part of our discussion, but from throughout the afternoon's discussion? Maybe, Deirdre, could I ask you to... Sure. What struck you from this afternoon?
There's a couple of things that strike me, and I just want to make one very small comment about the Irish language. The Irish language is alive and well on Twitter and Facebook. A lot of my old school friends from primary school and so on, there are Irish language conversations going on, which is great, which is an aside really. Information overload is something that I think is hugely important, and the traditional approaches to how you look at information, assess information, research and so on has changed, because there's so much information there that you can't possibly begin to even distill all of it, never mind go into a deeper research on any of it. And I don't know, I mean, I find myself is that I prefer deeper research. That's what I find most interesting, but actually I can't do that. I have to skim, and I have to just skim through and see what catches my eye and so on, and it's not really an answer at all, but it is the need to change how we approach this research, how we need to change how we approach our assessment of information and doing our learning and our educating of ourselves, because you know there are hundreds of thousands of tweets and Facebook posts coming through into my feed alone, and I don't have a particularly large community online, and it's averagely large, but I know other people's are much larger, and you just can't get through them all. But there has to be some kind of skimming, filtering. There's this natural filtering going through. I think that's one of the things.
Okay.
I think about that.
Amina, may I turn to you for any of the themes that were raised either in this session or throughout the afternoon? What do you think has struck you the most?
I think again, just to go back to the basics, which is, I think everybody sees that there's an enormous opportunity, and it's really just about trying out what works for you. And I think in that process, not obviously being kind of strategic, but not overthinking it either. I think it really goes back to what Deirdre said about, being really, and Claire also, about being very authentic about who you are and what your organization is. And I think it's the authenticity that catches people in that information overload. If you're skimming hundreds of posts, the one that's going to catch your eye is the one that comes across as most genuine and authentic, and obviously relevant to you, but the authenticity will come through. I think of there was one hashtag called I'll Ride With You, which came after there was a hostage situation in Sydney a few years ago, and in the aftermath of it, there was some prejudice against women who were wearing the hijab in the Sydney public transportation, and just one average Twitter user sent out a tweet saying, if you're feeling scared, I'll ride with you. And then she turned it into a hashtag. And it became really something no longer about transportation in Sydney or prejudice in Sydney, but something that kind of went around the whole world in a very organic manner because it resonated with people. That feeling of being left out, of being, facing discrimination, is what resonated with people. So again, the authenticity and the desire for change or to connect is what's going to always come through.
Okay, Claire, would you agree that with social media that the instinct, or at least the capacity that it delivers, is that of including rather than excluding, and giving people that chance to engage that they wouldn't otherwise get? But I suppose at the same time, being clear about whether or not it's right for you is also another question that's fair to ask.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think it's fair to say, and again, if we're going to talk about information overload and so on, excuse me, our own individual behaviours, as the technology has changed, our own behaviours have changed as well in terms of the way in which we consume content and the way in which we engage with other people. In terms of inclusion and conversation and so on, again, we are all human beings on the other side of that mobile screen. There are some people who are much more chatty than others and who are going to be having a discourse on social media on a regular basis. There are other people who are perhaps quieter and prefer to read sources which come to them and so on. I think our own personal management of our social media consumption is something which we're seeing a little bit more kind of self-ownership coming in and a degree of self-regulation. When I was a child growing up, we had 2 TV channels, and that was it. And if I could have sat there watching TV for 6 hours every evening, then I would have if my mammy had let me. But my mammy did not let me, and so I went outside and played. I think what we're seeing increasingly now in the social media space, again, with this information overload, with the huge degree of stimuli and different information points which are coming into our social media feeds, I think we're going to see a lot more, and we're already seeing people curating their experience a lot more. I have some ridiculous number of Facebook friends at this stage, almost 1,000. I'm not actually engaging with those 1,000 people every single day. I've hidden a lot of them from my feeds. There are others who I chat with on a regular basis, and so I'm seeing more content from them. I think we're also seeing a little bit more of a move towards longer form, which again, in terms of, Deirdre, you were speaking about, there is this desire to go deeper in our consumption of media. I think we did go a little bit light for a while. We were all so excited by social and by the quickness of it and the immediacy. And then there's been a little bit of a rollback and people feeling, actually, I'd love to know more about that. It's something we see with politicians' Facebook pages quite a lot. Their posts, which actually perform best, tend to be the longer ones rather than the shorter, which is always surprising. Back in the day, it would have been the shorter form. There's a desire within us to go deeper and to understand more, but we're still using social to do that. So I think it's a question of, the choices which we're making in terms of, again, having that cut through, resonating with people, and then people getting a little more brisk about curtailing the information they're not interested in receiving.
Okay. So it can be quick, it can be accessible, but there can be depth there as well, perhaps on occasion. Okay, so our time is rapidly running out. In the minute or so that's left available to me, I do want to once again draw your attention to this communication handbook, and one of our contributors from the floor very kindly drew attention to it, so perhaps did my job for me. But we hope you do find it useful. It talks about, you know, the various steps that would assist in trying to develop a workable communication strategy, and then specifically on the theme of using social media to aid your work. I'm sure on behalf of Katrina and her team, if there are any feedback or views that you'd like to share with us, we'd be only too delighted to receive that and to hear from you, you know, maybe in a few months' time or in a year's time, whatever, just how you think this has worked for you, and if there's any improvements that we could make or any additions to it or changes, we'd be very glad to do that. So we have stuck to time. I want to thank our panelists for all your contributions, for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I particularly want to thank everybody who's joined us for the discussion this afternoon, for all your questions and comments. It's been a lively discussion. I have to say, I didn't feel that it was, the time went by quickly. I didn't feel it was a lengthy discussion at all. We could have continued, but we're now just at the 4 o'clock point, I think, due to take some tea and coffee, and I think it's very well deserved. So thank you all very much indeed. Okay.